Hello, and welcome to the University of Toronto Joint Centre for Bioethics 2024-25 Bioethics Seminar Series. My name is Jennifer Gibson. I'm Director of the Joint Centre for Bioethics here at the University of Toronto. Today's seminar introduces a new edited collection entitled Intellectual Disabilities and Autism, Ethics and Practice, and features a discussion panel of chapter authors facilitated by the book co-editors, Dr. Andria Bianchi and Dr. Janet Vogt. Before we begin, though, I would like to invite us to open this gathering in a good way by acknowledging this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The format of today's seminar is as follows. After my brief opening remarks, I will introduce Drs. Bianchi and Vogt, who will facilitate the panel presentations and discussion with book chapter authors. Ample time has been set aside for question and answer with the panelists and you, the audience, after the presentations. During the discussion period, we invite you to pose a question using the YouTube chat function, or you can send your question via email to jcb.ea@utoronto.ca. Questions will be grouped by theme and summarized to ensure as many questions can be addressed during our time together. Please note that today's seminar is being recorded. You will be able to access it along with other archived JCB Bioethics seminars on the JCB's YouTube channel. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's seminar facilitators. Dr. Andria Bianchi is a clinical ethicist at the Centre for Clinical Ethics of Unity Health Toronto, where she supports multiple post-acute care organizations, including Surrey Place. Andria is an assistant professor, status only, in the Division of Clinical Public Health in the Joint Centre for Bioethics within the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. She's also an affiliate scientist at the University Health Network's KITE Research Institute, which studies complex rehabilitation science and is dedicated to improving the lives of people living with the effects of disability, illness, and aging. Andria's primary areas of ethics expertise involve topics related to dementia and people with intellectual disabilities. Dr. Janet Vogt is a senior research associate and manager at Surrey Place, which is a not-for-profit organization in Toronto and Northwestern Ontario that helps people of all ages with autism, developmental, and sensory-related concerns. At Surrey Place, Janet has experience with its Research Ethics Board, Clinical Ethics Committee, and Ethics Education Working Group. She's also on the Board of Directors for Toronto's Community Ethics Network and is treasurer of the Ethics Special Interest Research Group of the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Janet is also a graduate of the MHSc program in bioethics at the University of Toronto. Andria, Janet, and distinguished panelists, on behalf of all of us at the Joint Centre for Bioethics, we welcome you to today's seminar.
Thank you so much for the very warm welcome, Jen. Hi, everyone. It's a delight to be here with you today. I will attempt to share screen. Hopefully technology decides to cooperate with us today and we can get things started. Would you mind just giving me a quick thumbs up or head nod? You can see the screen okay? Thank you so much. All right. So thank you very much for that really warm welcome, Jen. We really appreciate it. And thank you to the Joint Centre for Bioethics for hosting this seminar series where we can have a book launch and celebrate all of the authors' contributions to this volume. We are very excited to be with you today. And so over the next 4 minutes or so, Janet and I are going to speak about the motivation, the rationale for co-editing this volume. And then we will jump into presentations by 5 speakers that will speak on 4 chapters that they contributed to the volume. And in advance of each presentation, Janet and I will offer an introduction of the speaker so you can get to know them a little bit yourself. And as Jen very kindly mentioned, we will have ample time for questions and discussion. So we would encourage you to take notes, think of questions, share reflections throughout our time together today on any of the topics being discussed and beyond, so we can have a fruitful conversation together. And so I will pass it over to Janet to talk a little bit about the motivation for this volume.
Thank you, Andrew. And good afternoon, everyone. Human society is rife with ableist stereotypes and societal norms that influence the lived experience of people with intellectual disabilities and those on the autism spectrum, ultimately negatively impacting their health, well-being, and ability to flourish. Despite the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, neurodiverse people continue to experience various forms of oppression and unjust treatment across the globe. The inspiration for this book came from our shared experience in academic bioethics, where we felt the need to respond to the paucity of dialogue on ethical issues arising from the treatment of neurodiverse populations. This book brings together authors from a variety of disciplines, some writing at a more theoretical level, and many providing very practical responses to these ethical issues. We also strove to ensure that the writing, for the most part, is accessible for those without formal ethics training. Back to you, Andria.
Thank you so much. And so part of the reason why we are so excited to celebrate this book with you is because it was quite a process to develop it, with over 40 authors, over 30 chapters, and many twists and turns along the way. It's extremely exciting to see that this book is finally out and it is available and a part of the bioethics literature. And if you are interested in learning more about the process of developing this book, of course, we're happy to respond to those types of questions as well during the discussion period. But I will pass it over to Janet now just to talk a little bit about the structure of the book as a whole, and then we'll jump into all of the presenters for today.
The book explores 6 overarching topics: moral status, capacity and consent, inclusion and empowerment, sexuality, intimacy, romance and parenting, healthcare, and ethical responses to so-called behaviors, often referred to as challenging behaviors. The chapters related to inclusion and empowerment are divided into 2 parts: those written at a more theoretical level versus those that focus more on the practical work to address some of the ethical challenges identified. Back to you, Andria.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And so lots of things happening in this book, lots of topics and areas covered, each of which are of ethical significance. And so today we're going to have 4 different chapters covered, and the authors of those chapters will speak for about 12 minutes or so each to provide an overview of their contribution to this volume. And the first chapter that is going to be discussed is intellectual disability, euthanasia, and assisted suicide. And so I am delighted to introduce the speakers and the authors who will talk about this chapter. Tim Staton is Emeritus Professor at the School of Social Work and co-director of the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship, University of British Columbia. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics in Disability Rights and Social Policy. He was a founding member of the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Ethics Group, and he served on the Council of Canadian Academy's Expert Review Panel on Medical Assistance in Dying, and is the author of several journal articles and book chapters related to assisted suicide. Trudeau Lemons is professor and Scholl Chair in Health Law and Bioethics at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, with cross-appointment to the Dalai Lama School of Public Health. He has testified before national and international parliamentary committees and courts on his areas of expertise, including as expert witness for the Federal Attorney General in the Trucon versus Canada AG case. And he recently co-authored an ethics report on options for assisted dying for the Jersey government. And he was a member of a content committee for the Nuffield Council's recent public engagement project on assisted dying. He is currently a member of the Ontario Chief Coroner's MAID Death Review Committee and co-editor of the 2025 McGill Queen's University Press volume, Unraveling MAID in Canada, Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide as Medical Care. And so with that, I'm delighted to turn it over to Trudeau and Tim to talk about their chapter.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrea and Janet, and congratulations on getting this over the line. I know these things are not easy, so well done, you guys. And Jen, thanks for the warm welcome. I'm sure you're looking forward to hearing Trudeau and I again. Jen chaired our committee on the CCA review, so it's nice to reconnect with her. Uh, so as your introduction probably indicated, Trudeau and I have been involved around the assisted suicide and MAID debate for quite some time. And to some degree, it's been a involvement of necessity or concern. And so when we thought about this chapter, we wanted to look at what, if any, issues or potential issues for people with intellectual disabilities related to euthanasia would come up. So that was kind of the thinking. So we can go on to the first slide. So part of the concern, and Janet mentioned this a little bit in her intro, that the people with intellectual disabilities have a very long history of devaluation, dehumanization, and elimination. And one can go back to the Greeks, through the medieval period, and certainly the eugenics era, and the Action T4 as part of the Nazi Holocaust. It was targeted largely at people with intellectual disabilities. We also see, if we look at things like selective termination of fetuses with Down syndrome, where we know roughly 90% of identified fetuses will be terminated, which does raise some interesting questions. Well, what does that say about what we think about people with Down syndrome as a society and the value of their lives? And related to that we see in both philosophical text and bioethics discourses that this very problematic presumption of suffering in the lives of people with intellectual disability and presumptions around low quality of life, which are often used to justify some eugenic-like practices. And to some extent, the philosopher Shelley Tremaine has argued that bioethics is inherently eugenic in and of itself. So it's a context, if you like, where being concerned is not an unreasonable response. So, okay, I'm going to turn it to Trudeau for our next slide.
So in the book chapter, we start with the question, obviously, should we be concerned about euthanasia made in the context of persons with intellectual disabilities? And in that context, it's often argued, certainly in the beginning of the debate in Canada, it was, we shouldn't be worried about a practice of euthanasia or medical assistance in dying in that patient category because they will be protected by capacity and consent requirements. And so often a kind of a presumption that, well, people with intellectual disabilities will not be consenting to that practice. We point out in our chapter that there is a dilemma because Article 12 of the International Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has introduced a concept of capacity, or emphasizes actually a concept of capacity that has been interpreted by the committee of the CRDP as emphasizing universal capacity regardless of any form of intellectual disability or any other form of disability. And while we subscribe to that emphasis on recognizing universal capacity for decision-making of persons with intellectual disabilities and other disabilities, we emphasize that this clause has to be interpreted as an empowerment clause that forces and that actually emphasizes the need for supportive decision making. Now, the problem is that in the context of the application of capacity standards in Canadian medical, and particularly also in the context of MAID practice, as we are seeing it currently developing in the Canadian context, that the idea of capacity does not protect people with intellectual disabilities. So we discussed briefly one case that already raised serious concerns in the 2024 case of a young woman where we can't say for sure what she had, but this was a woman of 28 years of age who got approved for MAID after clearly a form of doctor shopping. So she was first approved by one MAID assessor, rejected by a second MAID assessor. Several months later, she reapplied, was first rejected, then approved by a fourth MAID assessor, and the Alberta Health Services basically went back to the first assessor who approved her to solve the stalemate between the two doctors in the second approval. And it kind of raises concern about why was that happening. The father in this particular case went to court, argued that she was struggling with autism and with undiagnosed mental health issues. He obtained an interim injunction, which basically saved her life. But in a court decision on a final injunction, the court basically agreed that there were serious procedural problems with, or at least likely problems with the procedure. But he argued that she had an inherent right to ask for MAID. The right to choose between living or dying went to the core of her being. And the court basically said, well, the father and the parents can find some solace in the fact that they did their best to persuade MV of the value of her life and her parents' commitment of loving and supporting her, indicating that we already have in the current context approvals for people who allegedly struggle with autism. And so next slide, please.
Yeah, so there isn't a lot of Canadian evidence, just because our data collection is probably the weakest of any countries that allow euthanasia. But if we look at the Netherlands, which has the most robust euthanasia program, if you will, they collect qualitative data. So there's a requirement for a certain percentage of cases to be written up in detail and reported to the regional euthanasia committee. So there is a body of qualitative work there. They don't specifically look for IDD, but this team of researchers basically did a word search of the RTE files from 2018, 2019, and then up to 2021, I believe. 2012 to 21, and just word searched. And they found 39 distinct cases where IDD and ASD had been involved with the euthanasia program. Concerning in here is they found that about 21% of those cases, IDD and ASD were the sole cause of suffering. So this idea I mentioned at the beginning, this presumption of suffering. So basically that was the underlying cause. They also noted that physicians in one case noted there's no prospect of improvement as ASD and intellectual disability are not treatable. Well, obviously they're not treatable, but improvement is a rather subjective judgment. They also found, this is quite concerning, that there were no evidence around safeguards around the influence of physicians' own subjective value judgments. And lastly, that there were serious concerns about assessing whether the patient made a voluntary or well-considered request, and the stringency of those capacity assessments that were used. So all of this kind of contributes to our concern around the future of MAID and people with IDD. So back to Trudeau. You're muted, Trudeau.
Yes, so sorry. A related issue that is hotly debated right now, and is actually an issue that where Jennifer, Tim, and I on the Council of Canadian Academies had lengthy discussions, is the issue of advanced requests for MAID, because the advanced request for MAID is this form of MAID based on a prior expression of a future desire to have MAID performed at a time when we're no longer capable of decision making, when we're no longer understanding what's happening to us. And so you can see the link with arguments around situations of severe intellectual disability. And the concern that is expressed in that particular context is that it clearly crosses the line if we start practicing this, which is now already the law in Quebec and which is being discussed in the Canadian context. It clearly crosses the line of euthanasia or MAID without clear consent for reasons of cognitive disability. So again, a valuing or an expansion, a valuing of or valuing of a certain form of suffering associated with cognitive disability, where we see now the practice developing in an area where consent and capacity are no longer preventing or no longer the kind of the criteria that determine whether somebody will or will not have access to medical assistance in dying, but where the perception of the quality of life of persons with cognitive disability will play an important role in the determination of whether somebody will receive a lethal injection or not. So next slide.
So our concern around this is if we go to an advance directive, we have actually introduced a form of substituted consent. And if we've crossed that Rubicon, if you will, it really raises questions about whether there will be calls for guardians or parents to be able to consent to euthanasia on behalf of their sons or daughters with IDD. And when you first think of it, well, that wouldn't happen. But if you actually look at the public responses to familial killings of people with IDD, the public response is actually generally very sympathetic. There is actually quite a significant number of parents killing their child with IDD, sometimes because they can't cope, and sometimes jointly murder-suicides. And the court response tends to be very limited. We saw this with the Tracy Latimer case here in Canada, where there was extreme amount of public sympathy for Latimer, and continues to be this very academic source of Dr. Phil. Annette Corbeau is a mom in Ontario who has two adult disabled children, and she would like the right to have them euthanized. She went on a global TV news thing, very sympathetic. Robert Latimer was one of the guests on the case. She then went on to Dr. Phil, and he did his little vote, and 90% of the audiences agreed that she had that right. So I don't think there would be much public pushback if there was an attempt to introduce that. So if we open the door with substituted judgment, I think we have a very real concern that this could be down the line. Okay, we can go to our last slide. So it's just some concluding contents is we don't actually know what's happening with IDD and euthanasia just because the data collection is so poor and access to the data is so poor in Canada. We know that the MAID practice relies very heavily on discretionary judgment of individual assessors. It's very easy to shop around for assessors, and the regulatory bodies vary significantly in their judiciousness across the country. With Ontario and Quebec are somewhat ahead of the others, but in most jurisdictions, the regulatory bodies and to be honest, the police and the prosecution service has been very reluctant to intervene. As I mentioned, I think there would be very little public objection to mercy killing, as it's called. So if we look at the aggressive expansion of MAID in Canada to date, we're not convinced there's a whole lot of protection in what we would consider the premature death of people with intellectual disabilities. The lobby is very strong and very intense and continues for that expanse. So I guess the bottom line for us is we feel there is a need to start to discuss this and look at that, because we think there's a real concern down the line, and what we've seen to date with MAID is that things get changed before there's any real public debate or discussion of any substance. And so part of our rationale here is to get this onto the agenda for people to be thinking about. So with that, I think that's it for us. Trudeau, anything else you want to say to end up?
No, I think we'll be happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you very much, Tim and Trudeau, for presenting on such an important topic. Our next speaker is Dr. Jane Seal. Dr. Seal is Emerita Professor of Education at the Open University in England. Her work focuses on the role that technologies play in the lives of people with intellectual disabilities and how they are supported to use technologies by carers and support workers. In particular, Dr. Seal has examined how responses to the perceived risk of using technologies influence support practices and approaches to promoting the digital inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you, sharing my thoughts on the ethics of supporting people with learning disabilities to access and use technology. Just a little bit of context is that I'm working in the UK, so forgive me if I use the term learning disabilities, but that's the common term used in the UK and certainly used by people themselves in this country. So if we go to my first slide, please. Just reflecting on the journey from A to B that Andrea and Janet were alluding to. For me, the journey was, Janet and Andrea asked me to kind of write the chapter, and I hadn't really written or researched anything around ethics before, so I considered it a challenge. I thought, that's interesting. Okay, this will be a journey for me. So if we go to the next slide. The starting point for me was I've been working in this field as a researcher and also as a practitioner since 1987. And in the 80s, with the kind of Silicon Valley boom and all that new technology, don't know if any of you are as old as me can remember all that, but it was a time where technology, the discourse of technology was one of hope and potential. Technology was going to revolutionize education, and certainly within the field of learning disability was going to support them to become more independent, etc., etc. It was only at the beginning of the millenniums, the kind of 2000s, when a different kind of discourse started to come in. And I noticed two competing discourses, but both of them were around risk. So certainly when we were thinking about going online, the internet, World Wide Web, email, and all of that, and how so many much more people were getting involved in using technology, with the exception of people with learning disabilities. There was the one of the groups that was significantly disadvantaged because they just did not have the access, were not afforded the access, were not supported to access technologies, particularly online technologies. And so for me, that the risk was the risk of digital exclusion. That was something that really concerned me. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how can we support people to become digitally included? Is it about access? Is it about having the access? Is it about knowing how to use technology? Is it about being supported to use the technology? Is it about the technology being accessible? Is it about being able to be empowered and making informed choices about whether and how you want to use technology? That was where I was coming from. But I was coming up against this brick wall all the time, which was this opposing risk discourse, which is understandable, and it became stronger and more dominant the more we got into the millennium and the more we learnt about online abuse, online trolling, all the kind of online scams that we can be susceptible to. And that kind of fed into the narrative of, oh, people with learning disabilities are vulnerable, don't have capacity, can't cope with all this online harm. And for practitioners and for services across the world, particularly in the UK, the response was to go overboard. The English phrase is OTT, over the top, with safeguarding to such an extent that actually safeguarding meant just not allowing access at all, really digitally excluded, in other words. And this really frustrated me. So that's where I was coming from when Andrea and Janet asked me to write this chapter thinking about the ethics. Was, okay, can the ethics field provide a way forward, help us get out of this kind of stalemate where we can't move forward and support digital inclusion because we're so afraid of the online digital harms that might happen? And so if we move to the next slide, the kind of focus for the chapter that I wrote kind of starts off with a kind of exploration, a question that I'm asking myself and sharing with the readership of the chapters, which is, are there ethical frameworks out there already that might actually help me and others find a way of balancing these two risks so that we can move forward? And so the journey for my chapter was doing the literature research and then reporting on that in a way. And actually, or maybe in the Q&A, you can tell me whether you find it surprising or not. But actually what I found was there was very little research or debate on the issue of ethics of technology use by adults with intellectual disabilities. Maybe 20, 30 articles I found, not a lot at all. But what was also interesting, what little discussion and debate there was in the literature tended to focus on a very niche area, which is very small and involves very few people with learning disabilities, certainly in the UK. And that's the ethics of smart technology in care homes, telecare as it's sometimes called, because much of the smart technology is focused on surveillance, remote surveillance to work out whether somebody's safe, fallen out the bed, had a fall, gone out of their home, whether their blood pressure's raised, those kind of health issues that digital technologies are great for surveilling. And ethics-wise, that clearly raises issues around privacy, have people being supported to make informed decisions, how does that affect autonomy, etc. That was one area of the literature. Another area of literature that I found, unsurprisingly, was looking to Beauchamp and Childress, 2001, the four ethical principles that we all probably are very familiar with, and trying to apply those to technology use, thinking about autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. But nothing in that literature that I found talked about the ethics or injustice of digital exclusion, which I found really interesting. But if we go to my next slide, I found one article really quite powerful and interesting, and it certainly provoked a little bit of a debate within the journal that it was published, the Ethics and Behaviour Journal. And it was an article by Shalgumi et al., I hope I pronounced their names correctly, in 2019. Very small study, but important nevertheless. So it was a focus group with 6 people with intellectual disability, asking them about their perceptions of the benefits of using IT, information technology. And what they reported from their analysis of these focus groups discussions was they found that those 6 people were acutely aware of the concept of privacy IRL, in real life, if you like. They could talk about it, they knew behaviours that would demonstrate how to protect privacy. But what they also found was this did not translate when they were talking about their online practice. So they were unaware of the concept of privacy when their life moved online, so to speak. But what I found really interesting and encouraging in a way was that they didn't take this result as a call to shut down online practices of people with learning disabilities. Instead, in the end of their article, they kind of argued that with the right education, the right support and the right tools, people with learning disabilities can and are capable of transferring those privacy protecting behaviours that they've learnt in real life into their online lives and their online activities. And I think that's really pivotal and really important. And it made me smile when I read it, so to speak. And at the end of the article, they call for operational strategies and steps that can help us as a community reflect and take our reflections onto a practical level. So at the end of the chapter, and in my next slide, I'll share with you that where I got to was, okay, ethics hasn't given me all the answers, but it started to discuss that. But I kind of picked up on the call that Shalgumi and colleagues made for those kind of practical strategies to move forward so that we don't shut down access to technology. But we're also aware of how we need to support safe access and non-risky access, so to speak. And so I kind of end the chapter with my gift to the field, if you like, which is a response to the call, which was to turn to something that I've been working on before I even started thinking about ethics in a way. I initially called it positive risk-taking. I kind of positioned it as the mid-ground between these two competing risk discourses that I introduced to you. And I called it positive risk-taking. I've more recently changed the name to possibility-focused support, because positive and risk in the same sentence, people just didn't seem to cope with, and was still using positive risk-taking in more of a safeguarding, let's protect, rather than, okay, what are the benefits kind of way. But essentially, in my research, what I've been looking at is 4 kind of strategies, 4 kind of practices, things that I argue that people in support roles, people in the circles of support for people with learning disabilities need to develop. First thing is resilience. So I've argued that support workers, parents, carers, others need to believe in the potential of people with learning disabilities to manage risk with the right support, and that picks up on Shalgumi et al.'s argument. But I also argue for risk management, which is about putting in place strategies so that we balance the potential risks with the potential benefits, so that it's not just what if harm happens, but what if something brilliant happens out of accessing technology, and how do we balance that? How do we move forward? Shared decision making, which is about support workers and people with learning disabilities making decisions together, having discussions together around developing those risk management strategies. But the thing I'm most passionate about out of those 4 is actually creativity. And I found lots of evidence for that in the research that I've conducted with support workers. Creative, imaginative ways in which parents, carers, and others are working with people with learning disabilities to solve risk-related issues so that they can maximise the possibilities for positive and just outcomes. So that's where I end the chapter, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end when everybody's finished. But that's me for now. Thank you, Andrea and Janet.
Thank you so much, Jane, for sharing your expertise in your chapter with us, and response to the gap that you identified in solving the risk-related issues. Now I'm delighted to introduce the third of 4 kind of speakers for today before we jump into a question and answer period. And this is Abraham Graber, who is an associate professor in the Division of Bioethics at The Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. He has broad research interests. However, his primary research program investigates the ethical implications of the neurodiversity paradigm for clinical practice. Dr. Graber is currently the co-PI on the NSF-funded project, Bridging the Gap, a participatory approach to understanding and addressing the research-related concerns of the neurodiversity movement. And I will highlight that Abe somehow managed to pull together 2 fantastic chapters as part of the book, and he'll be speaking today about the first chapter noted there, All You Need Is Love for Full Moral Status. But there is a fantastic chapter that I personally really enjoy reading doing. Free Britney is the start of it. I would encourage everyone who's interested to certainly read his work. And with that, I will pass it along to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It's a real honor to be here. 12 minutes for this presentation is going to be a challenge. I think the other times it's been like 45 or 50. So I think I had probably best jump in. Title, All You Need Is Love for Full Moral Status. It's going to be a little bit more theoretical, I think, than the ones we've seen so far. Introduction, yeah. Here we go. All right. So the paper is really about moral status. We think about moral status in terms of the degree to which something matters from the moral point of view for its own sake. And when we think about moral status, usually it falls on a spectrum. So like rocks, they don't have any moral status. Doesn't matter how you treat them. Worms maybe probably have some. Dogs certainly have moral status. And we think about us falling on the spectrum. At the very top of the spectrum, at the very end of the spectrum is full moral status. And roughly that's kind of what we think people have. So you and me have full moral status. And then like having full moral status sort of determines how it is that it's you ought to be treated. So I put my dog in his crate all the time. Not all the time, rarely, like only when I need to. But the point is, if I did that to a person, to someone with full moral status, that would be sort of clearly horrific. So part of what determines how it's okay to treat someone is full moral status, right? Whether they have it or whether they don't. Figuring out like what the grounds are of moral status turns out to be really difficult. So intuitively, we sort of want to identify all humans as having full moral status. And we want to say like animals don't have full moral status. We don't need to treat animals with the same kind of respect or reverence that we reserve for fellow humans. But it turns out it's actually like really difficult to sort of make that case. It's very hard to sort of point to a feature, a morally relevant feature that all humans have, and that all non-human animals lack. And I think this goes back to some of the comments that were made earlier about the ways in which bioethics can sort of have a particularly negative view of people with intellectual disability. So some of the most prominent accounts of full moral status are going to say that full moral status is grounded in like advanced intellectual abilities, which gets the nice result that you don't have to worry about run-of-the-mill non-human animals having full moral status. But the problem is it's going to end up counting out people, and I'm going to use IDD throughout just for severe and profound intellectual disability. So just a heads up, most of these accounts are still going to count in people with mild and maybe even moderate, but they're going to say people with severe or profound intellectual disability don't have full moral status. So that's sort of set of views that I'm responding to. And the aim of the current project is to show that that's not true, that any account of full moral status that excludes all individuals with IDD are false. And sort of along the way, hopefully I'm going to challenge this methodology of like reasoning from the armchair about who has full moral status, reasoning from the armchair about how it's okay to treat people. So we're going to sort of take a quick detour. We're going to talk about love, and I swear we'll come back to full moral status. We'll make the way around. But roughly speaking, broadly speaking, in the literature, people distinguish between three different kinds of love. So there's agape, which is a universal goodwill, best characterized by the love of the Christian God for humankind. I'm not especially interested in agape here. There's eros, that's romantic love. I'm also not very interested in eros for this. So I'm going to be focusing on philia, and this is the kind of love one feels for friends and family. In the debate over philia, one of the debates you'll see in philia is whether or not we can have genuine love for animals, for non-human animals. So you've got someone like Helms up top there. He says, the love that I have for my dog is a deficient mode of the sort of love we typically reserve for persons. You have Jordan there. A human and say a dog cannot be friends in the same way that one human is friends with another human. So one group of folks who are theorizing about love say, you just can't love non-human animals in the same way that you love humans, right? And other folks disagree. So here we have Smuts again. Although many philosophers are comfortable denying that we can love animals, this seems preposterous to all but those sheltering some pet theory of love. And to this day, I don't know if that was a pun, but it ought to have been, hopefully pun intended. Good, so you have this debate. Can you have love, like the real kind of deal for animals? What's interesting about the debate is that while some people say yes, other people say no, both sides of the debate actually agree that there's a particular kind of love that is unique to humans. So some people say, yeah, you can have real full-fledged philia for animals, non-human animals. Some people say no, that kind of thing's impossible. But both sides are going to agree that there is a particular kind or quality of love that's reserved just for humans. And so, yeah, maybe we can love non-human animals, maybe we can't. But what I really want to focus on, and I'm going to call it sort of love, capital love here, and that's going to be the specific type of love we feel for other humans. And now you actually end up with a puzzle that I think is going to look familiar. So the real heart of the problem with full moral status is kind of drawing the boundaries around who has full moral status in a way that kind of meets with our sense, our intuitions that all humans have it and all non-human animals lack it. And actually, we end up with a really similar question about love. So capital love, right? The question is like, well, what are the boundaries around it? The most natural answer is to say that the boundaries around it are humanity. Like the reason we can love humans and we can't love non-human animals is that humans are human. But it turns out that answer probably isn't going to do. And there's actually a lot of arguments in the literature related to full moral status that are relevant here. But I think that the most straightforward argument, if your friend gets in a car accident and they go to the hospital and they come out of the hospital with like a pig kidney, we're not, this is like not sci-fi. Like we can't do it now, but you can probably do it in a couple decades, right? Your friend might come out of the hospital with like a pig kidney and like a chimpanzee heart, I don't know, like a lung from some other kind of animal. And probably at that point, they're no longer members of the human species because they're composed of all these different kinds of parts from all these different sorts of animals. And it seems clear that like the fact that they have new organs like doesn't prevent you from loving them. So you kind of have this problem then, okay, if it's not like, so we're like, yeah, we have this certain kind of love that's specific to humans. And then we can ask, well, why, right? What is it about humans that make them lovable in this kind of way? The answer doesn't seem like it can be that they're humans because we have these kind of counterexamples, right? So then we have this problem, right? Well, what is it exactly, right? What is drawing the boundaries around, capital love so that we can love humans, right? But we can't love non-human animals. Familiar puzzle looks a lot like the puzzle for full moral status. The trouble with, I think the answer to the puzzle for full moral status is like quite difficult. Here, I think the solution for the puzzle about love is actually pretty straightforward. So I think probably the answer we want to give is that having full moral status is necessary for being loved. And then, the inverse of that is being loved is sufficient for full moral status. So, like being a mammal is necessary for being loved. And, we can just flop that then and say like being, sorry, I said that wrong. Apologize. This is just a very basic point about how like necessity and sufficiency work. So sorry, being a mammal is necessary for being a dog. And it's just going to follow then that like being a dog is sufficient for being a mammal. So same thing here, right? If having full moral status is necessary for being loved, we can just flip it. That means that being loved is going to be sufficient for having full moral status. So this gives us a really nice solution for how we can draw the boundaries around capital love there. It's also a starting place for many philosophers who theorize about love, and that includes philosophers who think it's preposterous that we cannot love animals. And maybe we can talk about some cases in Q&A if people want, but I think it also fits really well for our intuitions about cases. So we start with sort of general puzzle. We have this particular kind of love that looks like it's only for humans. And then we ask, well, what exactly are the boundaries around that kind of love? It doesn't look like it can be just humans for some of the reasons we discussed. And then the question is, well, what is it? And it looks like a really plausible answer is having full moral status. But what that means is we can then use love as basically like a full moral status detector. If being loved is sufficient for having full moral status, then we can like look at the world. And this is the part where I'm criticizing this kind of like armchair methodology. Like you can't just sit in your office knowing nothing about people with IDD and like accurately theorize about who has full moral status. So the thought is once we know that being loved is sufficient for full moral status, we can kind of look out in the world and see who is loved. And once we know that, we'll have a very good sense about sort of what the boundaries around full moral status are. So now we can come back to that argument about love and full moral status. And basically, here's the argument. Love is sufficient for personhood or for full moral status. And hopefully, I mean, like I've given you a very abbreviated version of that argument, but hopefully you kind of get a sense of how it would go. So hopefully I've given you at least some reason to believe that the first premise is true. The second premise is some individuals with IDD are loved, and I think that's the premise that I still need to show. And then the third premise is some individuals with IDD have full moral status. That just follows immediately from 1 and 2. And of course, if some individuals with IDD have full moral status, it's going to follow that these sort of dominant accounts in the bioethics literature that deny full moral status to anyone with IDD are false. So I think it's a pretty straightforward argument. Hopefully, I've given you evidence for the first premise. The other, so the other, the big question then is premise 2. And I think the next slide is just highlighted. This is the question, right? Good. Okay. So here I have 3 selections from Kite 2019. Personally, I don't have a loving relationship with anyone with IDD. But of course, like there are lots of people who do. And I think probably many of you know them, so you probably don't need selections from Kite, but Kite has some really nice bits in the academic literature where she talks about, her relationship with her daughter and how much she loves her daughter. So I'll just read them. And these are all from her 2019 book. Knowing Sesha's capabilities, one gets a glimpse into the richness of her life and the remarkable quality of her very being. Our love and appreciation of Sesha as she was grew and became more expansive. Sesha has taught me that a profound love of another can change one's values and priorities. And there again, we see, Kite talking specifically about love. And how about this one? It is through my daughter's bodily limitations and her mental incapacities, not despite them, that I experience my daughter as a person. And keeping in mind that person here is usually a term for full moral status, or someone who has full moral status, and in more mystified terms, as a soul. So I think the evidence that there are people, or that people with IDD, with severe and profound intellectual disability, are loved is like pretty compelling. And that's it. That's the whole argument, love of the right kind is sufficient for having full moral status. People with IDD are loved in that way. And it just follows that, many people with IDD have full moral status. So the conclusion, I think, I agree with, I think, many of the other people who have spoken today and a lot of the motivations behind the project, that bioethics has a real problem with the way it approaches disability and intellectual disability in particular. I would like to think that that may be less of a problem inherent to bioethics and maybe more of a problem with like how bioethics has been done. And I think probably if we want to get past it, we can't just sit in our offices and ask like, from the armchair, knowing very little about people's lives, what life with IDD is like. And instead we should probably, get out in the world and meet people with IDD and see how their lives are, and then have our theory be driven by that, rather than kind of like speculation. And that's it.
Thank you, Abe. I especially like your call to get away from the armchair with some of these arguments. Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Bowman, a registered occupational therapist who works in Toronto at the Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. Laura's work with youths with disabilities focuses on social transitions and transitions into post-secondary education and employment. As a project manager in charge of knowledge mobilization embedded into a clinical team, Dr. Bowman's lens encompasses the clinical, experiential, research-based, and knowledge mobilization-based considerations for youths with disabilities as they navigate the aforementioned transitions. Laura, like Abe, is an author on 2 of our book chapters, and today she's going to present on a justice perspective on ecologically based employment pathways for individuals with disabilities.
Thank you, Janet. Chapter 17, if you read the book, you can flip right over. And I do want to agree with some of the other speakers today. As an embedded researcher, I don't often think about ethics or how to articulate it. So maybe with one of the other speakers today. So this was a really beautiful exercise to consider, what is the moral and justice argument for the type of work that we do? Maybe it's not obvious to everyone else. So having the opportunity to articulate why this is a justice argument and why our programs really align with an ethics perspective was really interesting and helpful. I'd like to first acknowledge the contributions to this chapter. So Carolyn McDougall is an occupational therapist with a long clinical history in supporting youth with disabilities to connect to the workforce. Dolly Menedak oversees our youth engagement strategy, is our interim director of collaborative practice and clinical education for the hospital, and is the senior bioethicist for our organization. And I'm Laura, I was already introduced, so I won't do that again. And really, the work highlighted in this chapter was made possible by donors to Holland Bloorview Foundation, which include the Azrieli Foundation and RBC Future Launch. And again, the type of clinical work that we do isn't always well understood. Again, another gratitude for this exercise in articulating it. So having foundations that will support this clinical work does make a real difference to our clients and to our society. Okay, so before jumping in, I want to review what we mean by employment. When we think of employment, we tend to consider or most value paid employment. However, employment participation has many facets that are part of a process of employment. So these include building the work-life skills required in the workforce, having access to opportunities, to mentorship, even to go so far as having the belief that one is welcome in the workforce at all. And many of these skills most easily or most commonly develop during one's youth, so teens and 20s, during a time when there are opportunities to develop skills, patterns, and levels of maturity. And this is also typically when youth are being prepared for the real world and can benefit from learning and trying these skills out. And I also want to point out that because this is when youth are typically being prepared for this real world, it's also a time when growth, learning, and that sort of mistake or risk-taking is more commonly accepted among youth. So it's not just a developmental perspective, it's not just, physical, cognitive, social developmental perspective, but also a societal and a structural perspective of when this needs to start. Now, measuring connection to employment by one's ability to secure a job, a paid job, is a measure that misses so many opportunities for intervention and to circumvent the stigma and discrimination that stop people with different types of abilities from entering the workforce. What's more, oppressive practices, policies, and beliefs that are located in this sort of below the surface iceberg metaphor. It's an iceberg, by the way, just in case people couldn't tell. Someone told me it looked like someone shrugging. The picture on the screen is an iceberg. But oppressive policies, practices, and beliefs that are located below the surface systematically and compoundingly reduce individuals' abilities to contribute to their communities, to engage in meaningful actions, and to financially support themselves and their loved ones. So really building up the process of employment is essential rather than just saying people with disabilities or people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are being excluded from the workforce or are not contributing to the workforce. Now, employment is important at a number of levels beyond the basic right to employment, which we're going to just assume here. Specifically, disability-inclusive employment opportunities are important to different facets or different levels of society. So to individuals, employment, particularly paid employment, but all types of employment, including volunteering, unpaid employment, chores, community connection, really contribute to quality of life, confidence and self-efficacy, belonging, community belonging and citizenship. It's a social determinant of health, so it contributes to physical and mental health, as well as income and benefits, so that financial stability. For employers, disability-inclusive employment lends to retention, builds an inclusive workforce, contributes to creativity and innovation in different ways of thinking based on different lived experiences, expands our labor market, which I don't know what industry you're working in, but our industry needs an expanded labor market right now, and increased profits. So there are a number of reasons and arguments for that, which I'm happy to provide at another time and are available in the chapter. And benefit society as well. So we see decreased funding for social programming. We see increased revenue from income taxes going back to sort of the public pocket, and eventually trickles into caregiver participation in the workforce. So if an individual is in the workforce, a caregiver can return to the workforce, again, increasing labor market participation, income taxes paid, etc. There is a trickle effect. So lots of benefits. It does matter. Now, from a justice perspective, in our chapter, we were able to, consider and investigate, and we state that the ability to participate meaningfully and equitably in the workforce is a right for all persons, including persons with disabilities. The evidence outlined previously in the chapter aligns with the right to employment as related to issues of health equity, with the building of society and economic capital. So we know that this has to happen. We know that this is benefiting multiple layers of society, and we know that people have a right to inclusion in the workforce. What is being done? If we know all these things, we must be doing something, right? So the information is based on Ontario and Canada as our context, but you can see similar interventions and patterns throughout much of the Western world. So we see evidence of the recognition of the right to participate in the workforce for equity-seeking and deserving groups. And at the policy level, this includes policies, conventions, statutes, and acts at the international, national, and regional levels. So we know that there's all sorts of acts and statutes that are telling us this is what should happen and this is how it might happen. From a regional and community level, we see social programs and interventions in communities, in schools, in organizations that target connections of individuals to the workforce. So we're seeing programs that are available to help individuals, particularly in our case, youth with disabilities, connect to the workforce and build those workplace life skills, as well as supported employment opportunities. And from an individual and service provider level, we're seeing a growth in programming and interventions to support starting early and connecting youth early on in the workforce to build strong workforce attachment. So with all of this knowledge, with all of the policy, with all of the interventions, why is current workforce attachment for Canadians with disabilities so low? Even more so for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. If we know and we're starting to do, what is not connecting? So on the next slide, we'll see that there's clearly a number of actors in the disability inclusive employment sphere. Traditionally, an initiative or intervention will target one of the groups on the screen. So for example, in our realm or in my realm of pediatric rehabilitation, the youth and their family are traditionally the focus of interventions to prepare them for the workforce. However, the workforce is not necessarily prepared to receive them and to understand their needs and their strengths, how best to place them for everyone's shared success. Similarly, if we target programs towards employers through education, training, compensation, we may be seeking to hire individuals with disabilities in a tokenistic gesture that doesn't truly benefit the organization or the individual, and can in fact have negative impacts on the company's future willingness to hire job seekers with disabilities. In reality, it's a shared responsibility between all of the actors, all of the bubbles on the screen. We have to effervesce together. It's shared. Any actor or group on their own, will have limited success with maximum effort, and as pointed out, can have unintended harmful consequences. So with that, we propose through this chapter that a framework for considering, you can go into the next slide, it's okay. A framework for considering models that fit an intervention, initiative, or idea into an ecological framework of the multiple players involved. So in this chapter, we propose the model of embedded employment supports, or the MEs, and each level has an explanation of who is involved, so sort of the larger type in the middle. what their responsibility is, so the smaller type towards the right, and the little letters on the left represent integrations, or how the responsibilities map onto one another. How do we work together? And I want to note that we positioned the individual or the person with the disability at the center of our model to meet our needs, very selfishly, to meet our needs as a rehabilitation organization. But the model can be flipped to have employers at the center or policy at the center, depending on your own focus, whatever will allow you to best connect the information on your end. So our intent with the MEs is to be a model used to map initiatives before, during, and after delivery to consider who should be at the table, who needs to contribute, and what other levels or contextual factors may have impacts on your initiative. Really, it's not dense ethical theory, it's not rocket science, which to me are very similar in my ability to comprehend them. It's really just a practical tool to allow you to think and plan out and consider opinions or perspectives that may not have been in your realm before. So as an example, in building supportive policy, the outermost ring in our depiction, there are integrations that flow both in and out. So opportunities H and I, the little letters H and I, represent policies that outline how public funding should be distributed and managed, and how employers are expected to engage, hire, train, and retain people with disabilities. Opportunity J depicts policies that guide how community and direct supports should work with persons with disabilities, employers, and the connection between the two. And opportunity D represents how advocacy of community-level representatives supports and builds relevant and realistic systems expectations based on real current employment needs and experiences. In the chapter itself, we go through all of the letters, we go through all of the levels. It's quite detailed. I'm not going to do it today, but again, plug for the book. Go ahead and read it. The goal of, just one more thing for the last slide, the goal of outlining the MEs is to highlight the interwoven responsibilities that we all share in this work, and how each group can contribute while also making themselves aware of the roles and realities of the other group, so that we can collaboratively and most comprehensively support the inclusion of individuals with disabilities in our workforce. And with that, I want to thank you for listening and for your interest in the book, and I look forward to the discussion.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Laura, for concluding the presentations. And so it is now time for questions and discussion. If you have a question, please feel free to put it into the YouTube chat. If you aren't logged into YouTube, then feel free to send an email to jcb.ea@utoronto.ca, and that email address should be in the YouTube chat for you to copy and paste. And we have a good chunk of time for questions, which is great. Let me just go to the actual question slide so I can see them coming in. Thank you, Terry, for being on top of everything. And so I will try to rotate just between the group of you in terms of what questions who questions are directed to. And so I guess just starting off with actually the first presenter and presentation around medical assistance in dying, euthanasia. The question is, are you worried about people with IDD actually not being provided with legitimate access to MAID if we focus so much on the history? Might we become overly paternalistic? Are there any concerns from that perspective that you might have? And Tim Trudeau, I'll leave it to the two of you to respond.
Well, maybe I'll kick off. It's a good question, right? Because it kind of gets to the heart of the dilemma, because you don't want to deny people with intellectual disabilities any right that anyone else has, right? And to some degree, that's part of the strategy of the MAID expansion, is to leverage that. And quite frankly, I'm not worried about it, because I don't think that's the main concern. I think if we could eliminate track 2, then we would address that question, because absolutely, if someone with IDD in the late stages of cancer clearly doesn't want to go on, if everyone else in the country has the right to access MAID, they should have the same right. The trouble is you introduce track 2 and it gets to be a very dangerous and volatile situation. So, Trudeau?
Yes, I agree with your assessment. So the idea is not, oh, we want to exclude persons with intellectual disabilities because of their intellectual disabilities or something that is beneficial to them. But our starting point is that we think that the inherent devaluing of persons with intellectual disabilities for their having a disability influences the way assessors will assess the persons with intellectual disabilities, and that this will also impact on self-perceptions of persons with disabilities, so that there's a kind of a cyclical reaction of perceptions of suffering, where intellectual disability becomes the basis to request and get approval for MAID. And people will say, well, obviously, rhetoric, people who believe that this is a good thing will say, well, if they say they're suffering, and they want to have access to that, why wouldn't we value that? There's still criteria in the law, in the Canadian MAID law. There is still an evaluation process which recognizes that this is not to be provided for mere suffering. It has to be suffering that is associated with something. And we would here start saying, well, if you have an intellectual disability, that's a basis to ask for MAID. Not if you just generally are a person without an intellectual or other disability and you say, my life sucks, I want to have a physician helping me to end my life, because then suicide prevention kicks in. So it's in the context of where we are indeed deeply worried that the perception of suffering associated with intellectual disability, the devaluing of persons with disability, will influence how people are assessing persons with disabilities and valuing their lives, and that this devaluing of life will impact on easy approvals. And we see already in the case that I mentioned, the Alberta case, that courts are saying, well, this is a medical, so it's also about the medicalization of intellectual disability. So the physicians have said that this person qualifies. It's not up to the courts to start saying that they shouldn't have access to MAID. Well, we are worried that the mere fact of an intellectual disability becomes a kind of a devaluing that leads to a justification of a facilitation of state-funded and physician-provided ending of life, which we think is problematic.
Thank you. Thank you for responding. And there's a couple of other kind of comments or questions related to medical assistance in dying that perhaps I'll have time to come back to. I'm just going to go in the order here of presentation. So for Jane, do you think that the lack of focus on digital exclusion, and there's a couple of comments related to just this concept of digital exclusion, but do you think the lack of focus on digital exclusion is because of ableism and the idea that people with learning disabilities simply can't use technology, don't deserve to? Just what are your thoughts as to why?
All of the above. Absolutely. I believe that much of the practice that contributes to digital exclusion is presuming that people have no ability to learn to use technology, have no need to use technology. But also, I wouldn't say it's large scale, but it concerns me anyway, is when I have seen and observed and read of examples where people with learning disabilities are given technology, sometimes expensive iPads and the like, it creates jealousy and a kind of, it's not fair. Why have they got that beautiful, expensive piece of technology and I don't? That's not fair. Jealousy amongst the general community, amongst carers. And I think it for me, it taps into the not human kind of, these people are not the same as us, they don't deserve the same as us, kind of thing. That means that digital exclusion in some quarters is not challenged so much. So there are lots of reasons why people with learning disabilities are digitally excluded, but perhaps I'll end on one that I'm focusing on at the moment, is that many of the people who work in the caring, supporting industry also lack digital skills themselves. They're not the most educated or the most digitally competent. And so there's a workforce issue actually in terms of building capacity for all those in the support circles to develop their confidence and competence. And once they're confident, to use themselves, my argument is that they may be more confident to support others to use technology.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you, Jane. Okay, so trying to keep track of everything. I think for Abe, there's a couple of questions, but perhaps one that came up twice is around this concept of love, the capital love that you're talking about is, and that being kind of demonstrative of full moral status and sufficient for full moral status in people with intellectual disabilities. And a couple of folks have just questioned, like, can't we, I guess, love like non-animate things, or what kind of love would that be? Or do non-animate things now have full moral status? So if you can just either clarify, expand on some of that, that would be great.
Yeah, no, I think certainly the answer is that we cannot love inanimate objects. So, that kind of notion of love, the capital love, is not my invention. It's something that's like fairly well embedded in the philosophical literature on love. Like, what is the nature of love? And there's just a wide agreement in that literature that there's a particular quality or kind of love that is just for other humans. And then I think it's worth asking questions about what that kind of love is. And I suppose you might think, well, look, that literature is just confused, and there is no quality or kind of love that's specific to humans. But I think on reflection, you'll find that that's probably not true. Like, I think if you think very seriously about the kinds of loving relationships you have, you're going to find, like, no, there really is an important difference between the way that you love your dog and the way you love your child. At least one hopes. And so maybe a key component there, though, is that it also has to be the case that, like, people can be, like, wrong about whether they love something. So maybe Chat GPT stuff is a little bit more difficult. You could certainly imagine someone who thinks they in fact love the Chat GPT bot with which they converse regularly. But I think it's plausible to think that that's just inaccurate. We can probably be wrong about whether or not we love something, and I think that's fairly plausible. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think there's a diverse range of people who are in the audience who are asking questions. So highlighting some of the philosophical literature that does exist. I mean, if you're interested in going into it, I think you can read Abe's chapter and actually find some of the references there that you can delve into. All right. In thinking about, there we go. Okay. So Laura, just and I guess there's two kind of related points here, but one is, do you think that our societies, so I guess the model that you've put forward has clearly been successful. It demonstrates that the social model of disability, actually, and the fact that people with disabilities can clearly participate in and gain employment and meaningful opportunities if society changes. And so do you think that our society's workforce expectations actually need to change in order to be more inclusive of people with IDD? It's so fast-paced, expectations are high, and many places might not be open to doing things differently. So is it more of a cultural, philosophical kind of shift that our society needs to engage in versus because the practical solution is something you put forward?
So yeah, and I appreciate you adding that last bit of this is a practical solution that we're putting forward. I'm an embedded researcher. I serve a clinical team. That said, and I'm also not like a philosopher or an ethicist by training. The answer is sort of. So I think the way that we operate a workforce, and this is, again, based on the research, but I'm going to give you an opinion as well. The way we operate the workforce right now is not sustainable. There is so much research on burnout. We are over outsourcing. We are losing domestic workforces, and that's reflected in our employment numbers, in our ability to operate the services, the essential services that we need right now. And I'll speak for Ontario, Canada, but it is a widespread issue. And the move for disability inclusive employment as part of a broader umbrella of DEI is not a charitable movement. It's a financial and economic argument that is based on sort of that basic element of people who can and want and are able to work in whatever way they are should have access to jobs that are appropriate, and knowing that people must meet the bona fide requirements of a job. So an example of something that we've been doing in our team is we worked with 9 Ontario healthcare organizations and 3 employment-oriented organizations across Ontario over the last year to co-design resources specifically for the healthcare sector in Ontario to support knowledge and confidence for disability inclusive leadership. And what that does is it really clearly explains, based in the social model of disability, what is and isn't accommodation, what is and isn't appropriate, and what will be contributed to your workforce by including individuals with disabilities. So the minute we make it into this charitable act, we, first of all, in my opinion, dehumanize individuals with disabilities beyond just tokenize them, and then create that cycle where we're hiring people, we're disappointed with their performance, and then we fire them and have a bad taste in our mouth, and then exclude this population more broadly. What we want to do is create these appropriate experiences for everyone that bring everyone up. So I will do a small plug for our Inspire, Hire, Train, Retain. You can look it up online. And just an example of how we're making sure that we're considering the different contextual levels, the different arguments to make more long-standing successful integrations with smaller opportunities. So we have to teach people the individual skills in individual programs, and we have to have that longer-term vision. Did that answer the question?
I think so. I think it answered and it went beyond, which is great. And if people do have any outstanding questions, I think they can email the JCB, and then we will certainly disseminate the questions or connect people as appropriate. And yeah, with consent, of course. So if there's any follow-ups, then please feel free to pose them. We have about 4 or 5 minutes left or so, and there's a broad question that was asked that perhaps, depending on your lens, you can respond. And this question is just, what are some of the unique collective responsibilities as researchers, healthcare providers, institutions for addressing structural determinants of health for people with IDD? And so if you're comfortable and want to answer that, then I would encourage you to do so. And I'll, but also if this is not fit within your wheelhouse, you just want to speak more broadly about inclusive practices for people with IDD, not just the structural determinants of health specifically, feel free. So perhaps I'll just open it up and ask if anyone wants to weigh in on that question.
So maybe I'll start. Somebody has to start. I think it's a very good and an important question that in general is often underappreciated in the context of the debates that we have around how to develop healthcare and legal regimes around healthcare in relation to persons with disabilities or persons with intellectual disability in particular, but which is the various intersecting components, the societal, economic, cultural components that impact on how people with intellectual and other disabilities can thrive. So I think it's crucial to have a more holistic understanding of how to design appropriate policies and legal regimes. And certainly in our chapter on medical assistance and dying, but it applies to many other contexts. There is a real danger in simplifying the issues by focusing on very narrow, specific legal rules and think that we've dealt with issues appropriately. So underlying structural components are front and center, should be front and center in any decision-making related to the healthcare and legal regimes.
Thanks, Trudeau. Tim, go for it. We have about 2 minutes or so.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's important, but I think particularly in healthcare and healthcare related systems, I mean, I think it goes more back to Abe's bailiwick, right? That I think they need to really do some self-reflection and how that gets played out. Because I mean, when we do, there's a really good study out of Harvard a few years ago. I think we referred to it in our paper that found that the general public has very negative views of disability. What was really interesting is that healthcare providers have even more negative than the general public. So if you want to start somewhere, that's where I would start. Because if you can't grasp the full personhood of someone, you can do all the policies you want. And Lord knows we've done all the policies that we've tried. So my plug would be step back from the indices, step back from bioethics, and go back to the kind of questions Abe's asking in a very self-reflective kind of way.
Love it. And perhaps, Abe, I think you'll have the final word here. Go for it.
I was going to push in the opposite direction as Tim. I mean, I think often what happens is you have these biases that then get built into the quality of life assessments. Like if you pull out quality of life assessments, it's like not at all a surprise that people with disabilities score lower, but that's because they're like deeply value laden in ways that are like really problematic. And I think you end up with this like reinforcing cycle. And I think, Tim and Trudeau spoke to it a little bit where like medical expertise is really like put up on the pedestal. But when you actually sort of like take the clothes off what medical expertise, what you get are these sort of like quality of life metrics that are sort of transparently bad, and just like obviously not really speaking to quality of life. And so I wonder if it's sort of a cycle, where you have physicians with dehumanizing perspectives that then get reinforced by the quality of life metrics that they're using, which then lead to sort of broader acceptance of these quality of life metrics that are really problematic.
Very cool. Thank you very much for that. And I think there's 30 seconds, maybe. Jane, Laura, if you do want to have any concluding remarks, we'd welcome. Please, Jane.
Yeah, 3 bullet points from me, really. I think as researchers, if we want to challenge structural injustices, we need to learn to translate our research in a way that's accessible to policymakers who have the power to change structures. And I think that's a real challenge for us to make our very high level kind of philosophical, ethical kind of arguments accessible and so on. But more passionate for me is around not thinking that researchers have to be objective. Actually, in this field, to be objective means to stand in the middle, sit on the fence. Actually, we have to be political. We have to use our voice, and we have to make the voice of people with learning disabilities heard as well. And that's not about being dispassionate objective. That's about being very political. And so that's my passionate plea.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jane. And Laura, anything to add?
I was just going to say, I know it's more complex, but agility and curiosity. So knowing that no matter how long you spend on the policy, it's not going to be perfect. Maybe start small, have feedback loops, have mechanisms to get that lived experience, feed it back, and be agile and open to suggestion. Different ways of providing policy for different ways of living life. So.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. I will share my screen again and welcome Dr. Gibson to share some closing remarks. And please let me know if you can see screen.
Well, my goodness, thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful hour and a half. I have taken notes. There's so much that you shared. It was insightful, it was nuanced, it was challenging. And I think it was also disruptive. I mean, especially for the field of bioethics that tends to have found its home focusing on clinical ethics. It's been problematized in a good way. And I think one of the things that's really powerful is that it's really sort of opened up where we need to be casting our imaginations beyond sort of the traditional questions that have been asked within our field. So I see that partly as an important challenge for us. But I'm also struck too by the ways in which, we learned about some of the important questions and deep reflective questions we need to be asking about as we engage in developing or implementing or contributing to health policy. And I think that's really important. The ironic role that technology plays in people's lives, and how, it's sort of really being reflective about that role, both as an enabler and is actually disruptive in other ways that may not be desirable. This unapologetic leaning into love. I'm reminded of Cornel West's comment that social justice is love, sort of what love looks like in public. And so this wonderful dynamic of, justice and compassion, justice and love, which come together, which really, I think, helped to reframe some of my own thinking about this, which was about, we were talking about well-being of people in this much more rich, robust sense. And so really challenging ourselves to think about, or challenging us who have joined you today to learn from your nuanced, insightful comments, what this may mean, whether in our own research, our own practice, our own day-to-day lives, in our classrooms. So really just want to say thank you all so much for your rich comments. And I wish this could go on much longer. So one of the things that I do want to do is to let you know how, if you do want to get a copy of the book, it just so happens that you can purchase the book with a 20% discount right now up until the 24th of March. And it's certainly a book that I will be ensuring that we have in my library. And I look forward to reading the chapters. The second update I want to share with you is that we've just opened our call for the JCB's AMS Fitzgerald Fellowship in AI and Human-Centered Leadership, again, disrupting our thinking about this, about technology. So if you're an early or mid-career health system leader, exploring the opportunities and challenges of AI in your health setting, or seeking to promote, foster, and advance compassion and equity in a rapidly evolving space, I do invite you to an information session, which is being held on April 17th. And you can also learn more about the program by clicking on the fellowship program page, which Terry will be putting that fellowship program page into the chat. And if you want to register for the information session, all you need to do is scan the QR code and then complete the registration. Finally, I'm pleased to invite you to our next JCB Bioethics seminar, which will be conducted in partnership with the Collaborative Center for Climate, Health, and Sustainable Care on April 2nd from 4 until 5:30. And the seminar features Dr. Stephen Gardner from the University of Washington, and on the topic of the early ethics of planetary health. And this will be facilitated by our very own Dr. Ross Upshur. So to sign up to receive our weekly seminar reminder emails, all you need to do is to email jcb.info@utoronto.ca, which Terry will put into the chat for you. Collaborative specialization in bioethics students enrolled in the CSB Interdisciplinary Seminar course, please remember to keep track of your attendance today. And with that, I will just say to Andrea, to Janet, to Laura, to Abe, to Trudeau, to Tim, it's great to have such folks coming from across the country and across the water as well. On behalf of all of us, congratulations on this important new contribution to the bioethics literature. And also thank you so much for this thought-provoking and insightful panel discussion.